So climate-related risk seems a straightforward term, certainly one that we can agree is quite important. We're going to try to dig in, however, to the complexity of what goes into understanding climate-related risk, embrace the complexity in ways that are required in order to really understand the different dimensions of what adds up to climate-related risk, and ask fundamental questions about risk to whom, risk to what, and what goes into it, what constitutes risk, how it differs by geography, by group, by issue area. And so we're going to lean into that complexity, but we're also going to keep in mind that while whether it's the readings, the analysis, and such, seems to have almost unlimited complexity and different categories, different terms, that we're not going to be disempowered or set back and held back in making progress in understanding and addressing climate-related risk because there's so much complexity around it. So we'll try to have that balance as we move forward. So the climate-related risk. Certainly, it is first and foremost about climate-related changes, frequency and intensity of storms, fires, flood, extreme heat, and there is a lot of focus on extremes and the kind of disaster risk as climate-related risk. Certainly, it is not to set aside the slower onset ones that might come with the cumulative impacts of drought and what it means for agriculture and such. And so we don't want to only focus on the extremes, but they do get a lot of the attention. It is about um, those impacts that are driven, often referred to as hazards. Now, the challenge is that for a long time, hazards were almost used synonymously with risk. And so it was only focused on those kind of direct impacts. And we've come to understand that that leaves an impression that what constitute risks is only about those phenomena and not the larger contexts around it, the social, political, and economic and ecological. And so a big part of this is starting with, yes, absolutely, it's essential to understand what the hazards are, but hazard is not synonymous with risk, and it goes far beyond that. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So it is critical to define some of these terms, and there's a lot of time spent doing that in some of the readings, if you even kind of scratch the surface on this, and we'll have that this week. But hazard is the possible future occurrence, so not just today, but the potential for tomorrow of natural human-induced physical events that may have adverse effects on vulnerable and exposed elements. But exposure, we add that, refers to the inventory of elements, or again, very technical, but in an area in which a hazard may occur, i.e., are there people where the hazard occurs? Are there economic resources? Is there infrastructure present? So you can have a extreme weather event, and if there's nobody there and there's no economic activity and there's no infrastructure, then it's not posing a risk, right? It's not contributing to risk. So you have the hazards, you add the exposure, right? Where is that hazard occurring? Whom might it affect? And what kind of economic or infrastructure is there? And then vulnerability, because not all people and not all economic dimensions or infrastructure are equally vulnerable. So the propensity of exposed elements such as humans, their livelihoods, and assets to suffer adverse effects when impacted by hazard events. So in this sense, if one has hurricane-proof shelter that one can retreat to, that's a lower vulnerability than if somebody has to ride out the storm without that infrastructure. And so climate-related risks, when we add these up, don't act alone, so to speak. They are connected and they are therefore compounding. So they don't happen in isolation. So we will hear the notion of compound risks, or as the IPCC defines them, compound risks are ones that arise from the interaction of hazards, which can be characterized by single events or the multiple coincident or sequential events that interact with exposed systems. So, in a sense, it's not Monday is one storm, Tuesday is another extreme event, but that these things interact and that that's critical to understanding the dimensions that help us really have a true sense of what is climate related risk. So what does this look like, so to speak? I think this figure helps us understand the interactions, the connections among these definitions of hazards, vulnerability, and exposure that add up to risks, right? It's where these three come together that we have the greatest concerns. Um, this figure also, again, goes into, I think, sometimes the temptation to have every single possible dimension represented. So we see how there's multiple risks, correlated risks, aggregate ones that add up, cascading that happen in sequence, interaction, and compounding. Sometimes I think we spend a lot of time on parsing these different ones. But I think the key points to take away are that it's not just about a climate related impact. It is absolutely required to be part of this conversation. So those hazards are part of the mix, but not the only part of the mix. The vulnerability has to be there and the exposure has to be there. And that's how we need to kind of understand how these terms come together and what they mean for really prioritizing, assessing, deciding how to respond to different climate related risks. But if that last figure wasn't complicated enough, it's also crucial to add another dimension, right? Climate risk, in part, has to have an inclusion of how we respond to climate risk. So the response, this figure adds another dimension of how we respond to them, right? Because we're not just passive in the face of these risks. We do respond in ways that impact the nature of the exposure and the vulnerability. The assumption is that those are well-intended responses and purposeful. Yet it often is critical to ask, lowering risk for whom, lowering risk with which tools, and which tools we're not using, which expenditures we're making, which ones we aren't, where we're doing it, where we aren't. And so the response dimension, that um, uh, social, economic, and political dimension is an additional part of really understanding what the ways that climate risk manifest and importantly how we respond to them. So there's certainly plenty of challenges in assessing risk. Sources of uncertainty, right? I mean, we on the one hand know in this space that we're always going to be operating in a context of uncertainty. We're never going to have complete certainty. It's just the nature of the dynamics, and in part because human beings are involved, and so we can't necessarily predict how they respond. So one dimension is just the causal links, right? There's still, even as we've made tremendous progress on understanding climate change and human contributions that are driving it, there's still at the level of complexity that we're talking about is going to be questions there. Limited data, and also what counts as knowledge, right? So this is a kind of a formal versus informal, learned and experienced knowledge versus the technical and scientific. When it works well, those things can come together. But sometimes, particularly the less formal knowledge is excluded from considerations and not seen as scientific or up to a level where it can be formally included. So that's both a lack of data, where we might not have it, but also kind of contested in which data, which knowledge is included. Um, and it's just really hard to predict, particularly the true extremes. We're many ways you could say we're really good at it, but nevertheless, the whether it's the location of a storm or the outbreak of a fire or how long a drought is going to last. Those are things that are really, really hard to predict. And then it is really hard to know with confidence how humans are going to respond and how they are going to adapt or maladapt to these challenges. And so, again, introduces more uncertainty. And so, again, it kind of emphasizes that risk is not just vulnerability, not just a hazard. It really depends on the capabilities as well. And as I said a couple comments already, risk to whom, right? And so this is where the justice dimensions are really present or should be, really location, uh, what we value, economic value. So, for example, if you Google climate risk on YouTube, uh, you will find that overwhelmingly the video responses are those that are companies or those working to support decisions in companies around climate related risks to corporate activity, reputational risk, supply chain risk, and such. And so there is a lot of focus on risk to private sector activities when it comes to climate. Now, on the one hand, to me, it's encouraging because they are uh, those are important institutions, serious institutions, and it'd be great if, in many ways, our public sector institutions took the issues quite as seriously. On the other hand, that really puts an emphasis on those entities and what they are and what they aren't, who they are and who they aren't. And so we really need greater attention to um, some of the dimensions that aren't just counted in quarterly economic reports, right? In terms of different communities, different groups, and where we would spend a lot of time focusing on the more vulnerable groups, right? And that vulnerability dimension, those exposure dimensions, and not just exposure of risk to a supply chain for a company. And so these justice questions have to be part of our considerations. Risk probability, and this is where, on one hand, it's straightforward, but you'll find that kind of everything is presented as catastrophic in all places at all times, right? And in many ways, it may feel that way, but some risks are high, some are lower, some are today and present, and it's a real challenge to move people beyond the notion that climate change is a future issue. It's a now issue. But some are going to be more manifest in the future, and so making those distinctions is difficult. Some are truly urgent and top priority, and some less so. And so, on the one hand, that's a familiar process in the public and the private sector to make those determinations. But it really behooves us as we're thinking about what does this mean in the localities that we're all operating in, and that we want to apply these kind of concepts to understanding our local situations. We have to find ways to distinguish among them so that we prioritize what are always going to be limited finances to tackle these challenges. And certainly, not again suggesting anything that isn't in some ways obvious, but it really risk are heterogeneous, right? Is it about human life, disability, right? A lot of the heat dimensions are going to be questions that yes, there's going to be mortality, but there's also going to be a lot of in the category of disability. So lots on health, and we'll hear from Dr. Cruz in this course about climate change and health. Um, Displacement of people, loss of income, property loss, social disruption, the ecological dimensions. These risks have multiple manifestations and multiple impacts. And so, again, risk to whom, risk to what, it just makes it more and more kind of complicated, which, of course, it makes it also more challenging, but I would say more realistic to truly understand the dimensions of the challenges we face. So it wouldn't be surprising if you had this feeling of, oh, it's just so much complexity, so overwhelmed. I will admit, in reading and studying and participating in processes like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where some of the readings are drawn from in the National Climate Assessment, it's really easy to feel overwhelmed, to see, to be able to acknowledge that the complexity is really important, but that, oh my goodness, it can be just debilitating in terms of ways forward and how to take steps into it. We're going to acknowledge that and understand that, and in kind of and therefore not try to reflect that infinite amount of complexity in its various forms. Appreciate that it's there. Appreciate that there are these kinds of analyses, some of which you'll be reading, that really do get to these fine grained distinctions. But at the same time, we'll try to do it in ways that give us some frameworks that allow us to lean into understanding that risk is not easy, simple, the same, unicausal, and such, but we'll avoid getting overwhelmed by it and the minutia and the parse definitional differences. We'll lean into tools that help us organize and analyze a situation. And so this implementing the steps to resilience, which is a US government part of the climate resilience toolkit. We'll be reading that portions of it throughout the course, so you'll have read the whole thing by the end of the course. It really is a kind of practical how-to, not something that we'll do in great detail. In fact, it's meant to be, what would be a months-long process in a given situation, but it gives us a sense of how it would be done, allows us to draw upon it, gives us the framework to help in some ways focus on what's important, figure out how to make those assessments, and also then therefore not be kind of overwhelmed by the complexity. And kind of important to remember that we don't want to kind of stress ourselves out about finding the right answer, or the precise answer, because there rarely is one. So that's a little bit of a walkthrough on climate related risks, some of the important definitions, a little bit about how they fit together, and then a number of kind of additional dimensions that make it even more and more complicated. But I'm hoping that by starting with the sense of complexity will allow us to get more focused and focus on our given local situations and understand what's important there, what things rise to the top, and find ways to do the kind of climate related risk assessments in ways that allow us to move forward rather than be paralyzed by the complexity.